This is House Planning Help, episode 376. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Toby Cambray from Greengage. We're going to get an introduction to WUFI, which is a moisture simulation tool. We're talking moisture risk and finding out why that's relevant. A warning too, it will get technical, but not that technical. Firstly, because I'm here, and secondly, because I do not intend to venture into the weeds. Before we get going, a quick favour to ask, and that is, would it be possible for you to spread the good word of the podcast, particularly if you know someone who's thinking about a project, be it a new build or a retrofit? Could you find an episode that they might like? Hopefully they'd like quite a few of them, but if you can be specific to where they are today, something that will help them, then that might get them hooked. Just remember, we're always trying to highlight professionals who are doing great work and self-builders who've been through the process and just want to share for the next lot of house builders and retrofitters. That's what we're here for. Thank you very much. Let's get to our featured interview with Toby Cambray. We're going to explore moisture risk today, find out why it's relevant, and we'll also learn about a key tool that gets used. This is WUFI. But I started by asking Toby to tell me a little bit about what he does at Greengage.
We started our practice in 2010, myself and my partner Hannah. So that's Greengage, and we do M&E and building physics. So we do a lot of design for passive houses, and we do certification now as well. And I did the passive house course back in 2011. And as a result of that, we started doing new build, but also retrofit projects. So people were interested in doing passive housey kinds of things to existing buildings. And this was before NFIT was a thing as well. And it sort of quickly became apparent that when you start adding insulation to buildings, moisture is kind of thing that you have to pay attention to. So I started looking into this and found this thing called WUFI, and I thought I'll go and do that course and I'll be able to solve all those problems in that very naive kind of way. And 10 years later, I'm doing an awful lot of that work. And I've gone down that rabbit hole pretty deeply and coming towards the end of a PhD on a moisture in buildings topic as well.
What are we talking about when we use the words moisture in relation to a building?
Well, pretty straightforward on one level. So moisture is the word that we use to describe any form of water, so liquid water or water vapor, or even ice associated with buildings. So we find water in the air, and depending on the temperature and the amount of water, we'll have different levels of humidity. And obviously with a lot of building materials, particularly historic building materials, the way they interact with liquid water is quite important as well. So porous materials will generally store and transport liquid water as well as water in the vapor phase.
So this water, why does it move around in a building?
So ultimately, it's whichever law of thermodynamics it is, which is the second. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Basically, all kind of things want to try and minimize their energy. So if you have an area of high pressure next to an area of low pressure, the molecules there will try and even themselves out to minimize that total kind of net energy. And that's basically what's happening in different contexts with water. So if we have an area of high vapor pressure, so lots of water in one area, it will try and diffuse around to distribute itself as evenly as possible. And that's a thing that's kind of pretty universal in all physics.
Why don't we just leave it?
Well, water is really important for most forms of life as we know it. And some of those forms of life we just don't really want in our buildings. So in particular, mold, but also timber decay. All of these organisms evolved on the forest floor, and they're very good at digesting wood. But if our building's made of wood or wood products, then we don't want that. Then moisture can also lead to corrosion of ferrous materials, so steel in particular, and also particularly of interest to people with heritage buildings or involved with heritage buildings. It can lead to or be involved with the deterioration of masonry as well, so freeze-thaw damage or salt transport and crystallization, and these kind of things that can lead to damage to masonry materials as well.
So do we stop the movement of moisture, or do we just know it's happening?
Well, broadly speaking, there's two strategies. It's more complicated than this, but the simple version is your strategies are either moisture blocking or moisture managing, or moisture open, moisture closed, moisture open, same kind of terminology. The way most buildings are designed nowadays, so new buildings, is moisture closed or moisture blocking. So we have design features like damp-proof courses, vapor control layers, and all these things that are intended to stop moisture getting where we don't want it. So a damp-proof course stops the moisture getting from the ground up into the superstructure. Traditionally, those kinds of materials weren't available to builders, and so they learned to work with the materials that they had in a way that manages the moisture. So broadly speaking, they will be able to absorb and hold a lot more moisture kind of safely, and then allow it to dissipate again. So you might get rain on the wall in the winter, and the wall be designed in a vernacular kind of way to be able to hold that moisture and then release it again in the summer with no kind of ill effects.
I've heard this word dew points. So what is that?
So the dew point is a temperature, and it's the temperature at which you will get condensation for a given state of the air in terms of humidity. If you see condensation on your beer glass in the pub on a lovely autumn evening, then that condensation is occurring because the surface of the glass is below the dew point of the air. It's sometimes used in the context of building assemblies to understand whether we're going to get condensation inside the building structure, which is definitely something we want to avoid. But especially with masonry materials and traditional constructions, it's a bit more complicated than that, and that's not a great way of understanding moisture risks within a construction.
Do we need to understand anything more about moisture before we talk about modelling it?
Yes.
Of course, that was the obvious answer.
Yeah. I mean, I've been doing modelling work for 12 years or something now. There's still lots I don't understand enough about in terms of the processes that we're trying to represent in the model and in the simulation. And there's lots of shortcomings in any model, in any simulation. It's the old George Box thing. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. So I think the more that we as practitioners individually understand about the physics of what we're trying to represent, the better we can kind of understand when the models are useful and to make use of the models. So there's an awful lot that you can understand, and what you should sort of understand before you open up that software. That's, an interesting question. And I'm not sure I've got a good answer to it yet, but...
Let me give you another question then. So how long has this been around for, this software, and what's the origins?
Well, people have been trying to calculate what's happening in terms of moisture in construction for probably 100 years now. So some people will refer to a dew point calculation. And that is a simple method that I think the US Forestry Service came up with in the 1930s maybe, to basically understand whether, if you have insulation in your timber frame, whether you're going to get condensation on those timber components. And that's just a simple kind of analytical method for user vapor pressure, we call it, so kind of humidity, to work out whether you're going to get that condensation or not. That evolved into the Glaser method, and that was really designed to work out whether you're going to have condensation problems, particularly for big industrial chillers and cold storage units. So not necessarily quite the same thing as what we have in buildings outside with rain on them and that sort of thing. So the important thing with those methods to remember is that they don't take any account of rain on the outside. They don't take any account of moisture transport and storage in liquid form. It's just about that gas diffusing through the structure, which is maybe okay for some situations. But when you have other situations going on where you've got these kind of particularly historic materials, masonry materials and things, storing and transporting liquid, that just isn't sufficient to make any sensible judgment around what's going on in the structure. And so in 1995, Hartwig Kunzel published his PhD, which proposed this method, which we now call WUFI, which is a piece of software which performs a more sophisticated, more holistic model of the way water moves around within porous materials. It's still not perfect, and there's uncertainties around the kind of materials that we have, and that's an interesting challenge, but it's a much more complete approach to understanding or to modelling how moisture moves around in buildings and building materials.
Let's say our technical person who's going to be doing the modelling, they're opening it up. What is it just to look at, first of all?
So it's a slightly old-fashioned looking piece of software, which is perfectly functional, but sort of function over form perhaps. But it is actually a very user-friendly tool, and there's a series of steps that we would go through to construct our model. We would build up a wall or a roof or another kind of element in the software. So we look at one particular element of the building at a time. And we're going to look at that usually in 1D. So WUFI Pro is the most widely used software that works along these lines. It is possible to do this in 2D. So WUFI 2D is a thing. Another called Delphin, which is a little bit more academic, a bit more complicated, but also more flexible and powerful. There's a few other tools as well, but those are kind of the two most commonly used. So we would create our build-up. We'd provide some weather to that. So we'd have a climate file with the sun and the wind and the temperature, humidity and the rain in there. We need to figure out some internal conditions. Yeah, that might just be 20 degrees and 50% humidity, for example, or something a bit more complicated maybe. And we'd set various other parameters up and then run a simulation. And that's going to predict the temperature and humidity or the moisture content at any point within our structure. And that's all it does, essentially. So it's going to tell us what the humidity is, what the temperature is in the middle of our wall or in our roof or whatever it might be.
So how is it outputting that? How are you receiving that information?
So natively in software, we can produce graphs very easily, or we can pull that out as a big list of data that we can do post-processing on. And that's a really important step, to take that temperature, humidity, and understand whether it's going to be a problem or not. And that's a big point of departure from the old-fashioned Glazer method. So with some of the Glazer software, what it's doing is basically telling you if you've got condensation or not. And if you have got condensation, if that dissipates again over the rest of the year. So that's okay, but it's really important to understand that you can have big problems with moisture, potentially catastrophic problems, in the absence of any condensation ever. So mold can, depending on which theory you look at, broadly speaking, will start to grow at a humidity of 75 or 80% relative humidity. Depends a bit on temperature and various other things, but in simple terms, it's that. So you could have a situation where there's no condensation ever at all, but you've got horrendous levels of mold growth because you're exceeding that 70 or 80% humidity quite often. And the point there is the Glazer method won't tell you that necessarily. Whereas in WUFI, we're going to get these temperature humidity profiles out and we can assess that as to whether we're going to get those kind of problems or not.
And how do we interpret this to make it useful to a building?
So a lot of it is down to the judgment of the person using it. You get a bit of a feel for these things after doing it for a long time. But we also have a set of post-processing tools that are quite useful. So there's a couple of different mold growth models. So I said that mold starts to grow around 75 or 80% humidity, but it's more complicated. And these models provide a more kind of holistic indication of whether we're going to get those problems. It will take into account the temperature, for example, and the nature of the substrate. So mold's more likely to grow on certain things than others. And how dirty the surface is and that sort of thing. So we can do various kind of post-processing steps to help us understand whether, 85% at 0 degrees is going to be a problem or not, and how often that occurs and what the particular time series is. It turns out the way mold grows and then dies back is complicated. If you get 1 hour at 90% humidity, is that a problem? Probably not, if it drops back down straight away. But if that persists for a while, then maybe we'll start to get mold growth. And these post-processing models take some of that stuff into account. Again, they are models, they're useful, but they're wrong. So we can use those to step slightly closer to the truth.
I was going to ask about accuracy. So how has this been tested over time?
Like any model, I don't know what the language policy is on your podcasting, but should we say nonsense in?
Clean. Yeah, nonsense in, nonsense out.
Particularly with stone and brick and these kind of porous materials, the particular combination of liquid transport properties and vapor permeability and all these kinds of things is complicated, and it's a bit tricky to measure. So it's really in the academic realm to kind of do proper measurements. But what we do quite regularly in our office is a sort of simplified set of measurements to kind of make a more informed estimate or a more informed selection from the database of materials that we have within WUFI. So there's a database of a few hundred different materials in terms of stones and mortars and vapor control layers and things. So if you've got a particular, if we've got Intello or something on the inside of our timber frame, then that's in the database. It's specified, it's new, we know what it is, that's fine. If you're doing an assessment on a heritage building that's some kind of limestone in Bath or whatever it might be, you don't know anything really about that material unless you do a little bit of measurement on it and characterization, because even within the category of kind of limestones, there's enormous variation depending on where it comes from, what the geological processes have been to get it out of the ground, all that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of uncertainty to do with that. There's also uncertainty around the weather, the internal conditions. Is it in a densely occupied house with rubbish ventilation? But the nice thing about modelling is that we can, within reason, play tunes on the model and explore these different issues. So I was just working on a report where we didn't have the opportunity to do any measurements on the stone in the building. So we tested, I think, 4 or 5 different kinds of stone to understand the sensitivity of the proposed build-up to that uncertainty. And we're able to kind of make some recommendations based on what the worst case kind of situation might be.
Yeah, I've been thinking where my moment was about Passive House. One of the big benefits is that humidity range, isn't it? That you're staying fairly much between 40 and 60. So is that the case right through the build up, or have you got to watch the humidity somewhere that the occupant would know nothing about?
No, so it will change quite a lot. And again, it depends on exactly how the thing's built. But an important basic concept is that if you have a bit of air and we cool that down, then even if there's no kind of extra water molecules in there, the relative humidity is going to go up. The dew point will come down. So the relative distance from 0 to the dew point goes up. So as you move through a build-up, so the job of the insulation is to maintain the temperature. That's one way of looking at it, at least. So you get a temperature gradient across that insulation. So as you move from one side of the insulation to the other, the temperature will kind of drop. All other things being equal, the relative humidity is going to go up. But that's actually, it turns out, the reason that we use things like vapor control layers to try and reduce the flux of moisture into that insulation to try and avoid that kind of issue. So that's basically the glazer kind of paradigm, we'd call it. Because when we have these other materials, so natural fibers, for example, or masonry materials that can buffer the insulation a bit. So typically in an internal wall insulation situation, for example, we want to maintain the ability of the wall to dry to the inside as much as possible, depending on the particular strategy and situation. So in that case, having a vapor control layer there is potentially going to do more harm than good. But it's kind of, it's a bit complicated. You want a little bit of vapor control there to stop some moisture diffusing in, but to try and allow it also to dry to the inside when the conditions kind of allow. But you were asking about humidity control inside the building. That's a slightly different thing in some respects. So as well as understanding the moisture conditions inside the structure, we can also look at the moisture conditions on the surface. And that's kind of simpler, actually. The kind of physics is simpler because we don't need to worry too much about this kind of liquid transport and storage thing. So I guess a simple way of thinking about it is, I guess, through the medium of thermal bridges. If we have a thermal bridge, sometimes they're called a cold bridge or a cold spot. And the reason is that at that point, the internal surface is going to be cooler, right? That's potentially a problem if it's cool enough to get down towards that dew point. So even if we're not getting that liquid condensation, we might be in a situation where we've got that humidity increased above that kind of threshold for mold growth. And that's why often you'll initially see mold growing in corners or other thermal bridge areas, because we've got some extra heat loss in that corner. We've got a cold spot, and that's reduced that temperature and boosted the RH just kind of enough for that mold to initiate around that thermal bridge. So we can do some numbers on that, and we can sort of work out whether that's going to be a risk. And it depends on the severity of the thermal bridge, but also on those internal conditions. So if it's already quite humid inside, you're much more likely to have a mold problem at the thermal bridge than if it's in a sparsely occupied passive house with very good mechanical ventilation. And we can actually design the ventilation system to the situation if we know what that's going to be, or if we can predict it in advance. So we would, broadly speaking, have a similar ventilation system on a per person basis, maybe. So, if you've got a large house for a private client that's just them and their kids, for example, you might have a similar size ventilation unit to a very tiny kind of flat where there's the same number of people crammed in there, because it's those people and their activities that are kind of generating that moisture internally that we need to deal with. So this is all slightly in theory, but we can design the ventilation to deal with those internal moisture loads if we have the opportunity. And one of the big problems that I perceive with retrofit, and something that things like PAS 2035 try to address, is this point that you need to make sure there's sufficient ventilation for the building and the occupants that are in there. And that's much easier to be kind of certain about if we've got a mechanical system. So we can, we design the ventilation system to achieve 100 meters cubed an hour, and we can commission it to make sure it's doing that. And that's trickier with natural systems, with trickle vents and that sort of thing.
So WUFI, the main time that we're using it is in a retrofit scenario, because presumably new builds, we're tending to do similar solutions. And does that help us because we know what's going to happen more or less?
Yeah. In BS 5250, which is the code of practice for moisture control, there's kind of three approaches. So you can sort of think of it almost as like a triage kind of approach. So on a very basic level, we've got simple constructions that we know as an industry work, and we don't need to do any kind of analysis of that or any numbers. And cavity wall, full fill, mineral wall insulation, whatever it might be, we know that works. We don't need to do any calculations. Then the sort of next tier up, I guess, is where BS 5250 would suggest a glazer method calculation. So for certain kinds of timber frame walls, for example, that might be appropriate. But as I was saying, there's kind of a lot of situations where that method gets applied where it's, questionable as whether it's really appropriate. And then the sort of most sophisticated approach, I guess, is to use something like WUFI. So WUFI is the most popular piece of software, but there's these others as well. And so usually we want to keep things as simple as possible, so they're nice and easy to build. So usually people will be using these kind of prescriptive approaches where it's a timber frame wall with something vapor closed on the inside and something vapor open on the outside, and that, broadly speaking, that's going to work. Okay, we don't need to worry about it too much. Where we don't have control over all those kind of variables, we are more likely to need to do something more sophisticated. So in a retrofit situation where we've got some walls, we can't control that aspect that's already in situ, we're going to need to think carefully about what we add to that wall to avoid introducing moisture problems. So the application WUFI is probably used most for is for looking at internal wall insulation, but there's other situations as well where you can get these counterintuitive or more complex kind of moisture situations going on. So with flat roofs, green roofs, for example, we've done a few pathology type jobs as well. So where we've got situations where something's been designed and built and something's not working quite right. Maybe there's some mold going on, or even timber decay and that sort of thing. And sometimes we've used WUFI to kind of help validate a kind of theory as to what's going on. So we'll come up with an idea and then use a bit of simulation to kind of explore whether that is on the right track or not. And then, maybe put in some monitoring and things to look more closely as well. So those are kind of the main applications.
All of this, you're doing your diagnosis, and then presumably you've said we need this much insulation or whatever it might be, this type of insulation. That's it. You've made the decision.
Yeah. And I mean, that's something that we take very, very seriously. So I think there is a tendency to err on the side of caution, which is absolutely the right thing to do for most situations. But I've recently been doing a bit of work with Andy Simmons, where we've got a design that is a little bit more dicey. We think it should be okay, but it's a bolder design than I'd sort of recommend to most clients. But Andy's happy to push that envelope a little bit and see what happens.
Fair enough. Now, I remember Martin Twamley talking about having a thin layer of wood fibre insulation internally, almost as a way of dealing with the moisture. So I hate to generalise, but are there little generalisations like this?
Yeah, so there's a whole kind of thing around thin internal insulation, and there's sort of reasons that you might want to go down that route. So broadly speaking, a thin layer of insulation applied very consistently is going to perform better and give you a better result than patchy, thick insulation. So if you've done a big, thick layer of insulation but not resolved your thermal bridges around the window or whatever it might be, then that thermal bridge could undermine the performance of that insulation to the point where you may as well have just done something thinner. So as I was saying, with internal wall insulation, the consensus now is that we want to use hygroscopic and capillary active materials and vaporic materials with the right kind of combination of properties can maintain the ability of the wall to dry to the inside. And in simple terms, the thicker those layers of whatever it is you're putting on the inside, the harder it is for that drying to happen. So there's a strong argument to opt for thinner layers of internal insulation. So people are kind of routinely putting in 40, 60, possibly 80 millimeters of wood fibre insulation, for example. And that seems to work okay in most places. If it's sort of very exposed, then we might need to be a bit more careful. But in a lot of the country, that sort of thing seems to be working pretty well. And if you can do 40 millimeters of insulation very, very continuously, resolving all of your thermal bridges and avoiding headaches around the stairs and window frames and all these kind of bits and bobs, you're going to be better off with that than a thicker layer of insulation that's a bit hit and miss and just where it's kind of easy to install.
So do people come to you with work, say, for example, on a house saying, this is what I'm thinking of doing it, can you check it?
Yeah, we do get inquiries like that. We would tend to pass a lot of those kind of simple things on to the reputable suppliers. So ecological building systems, in no particular order. Back
to Earth. Yeah, we've had Chris on.
Yeah. Suprema, Best of Lime, I think we've done some work with as well. I'm probably going to upset some people by not mentioning them, but...
Well, why don't I interrupt you so that you didn't have a chance to finish your sentence? And when we're talking about this, is there any way that we mess it up? Say, for example, when we're doing the insulation, we've had all this great modelling of what it's going to be like. You talked about little gaps in insulation. Is this back to bigger problems again?
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily a question of messing it up. So, for example, when we do a simulation, and this is good practice that one of the first things I'd look for if I'm looking at someone else's work, is whether we include what we call moisture loads or moisture stresses. So what we can do with WUFI, and again, this is something that is quite different to the old-fashioned glaze method, is that we can make an allowance for a certain amount of rain coming in through a crack or a certain amount of warm, moisture-laden air coming out through the airtightness layer and potentially dropping condensation when that cools off. So we can make an allowance for airtightness, for example. And in some situations, in most situations, it's a very good idea to have a good level of airtightness because that's reducing the amount of warm, moisture-laden air that can move out through a crack and deposit condensation in your timber frame or whatever it might be. And that's one of the big reasons that passive house is the way it is for that longevity, to avoid those problems of mold growth or even timber deterioration in the structure. And similarly for rain ingress, we can make an allowance for rain coming in through cracks into the masonry, for example.
So this is stress testing.
Yeah. In simulation, yeah.
What should we do if we're looking to hire someone to do this work? Do they need qualifications of a specific sort?
There aren't specific qualifications at the moment. I don't know if that might change in due course, but there's a 2-day sort of introduction that Green Register run, and that's a good place to start. It doesn't give you an awful lot of depth, so it's not much more than kind of which buttons to click on to really understand it and start to get comfortable, and to be able to offer proper advice. You need to do a lot more than that. A lot of it is experience, but there's a module basically on one of the master's courses in Dublin that Joseph Little runs. People that are getting into this will do that course as well. A lot of it is just sort of picking up that experience and finding academic papers to read and getting that background, and looking at buildings on site as well is a super important thing. Understanding the difference between simulation and reality, and where those two things depart, and what it means when you're putting certain parameters into the simulation.
Now, today's episode, really, we are hoping that our professionals do it. And could this be integrated within an architectural process? And is there anything we should be asking to make sure it's been done?
Yeah, I mean, that's usually how we're working. So, someone involved in the project will often raise a question around whether something's okay or not. If it's a listed building and Historic England or something like that have an involvement, then there's lots of people in those organisations that are asking the right kinds of questions. Often we'll get kind of referrals on that basis. But there's a number of particular constructions that should be assessed a bit more carefully. So, I mean, anything out of the ordinary will need some sort of assessment, even if it is kind of falling back to one of these prescriptive bits of guidance. But a competent architect should be able to do that and to identify when something is, not necessarily a problem, but should be sort of looked at in a bit more detail than one of the kind of established designs. And so that's kind of where we would come in usually, again, particularly in a historic or heritage situation, to help come up with a solution that's sensitive to that historic fabric, technically in terms of physics, but also something that works architecturally, can be buildable, and isn't going to cause damage to the heritage asset.
How long is this going to take you to model?
It's sort of how long is a piece of string?
How long is a piece of string?
Yeah, well, it's about 3.75 meters normally.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. It depends on the complexity of the project. So we like to spend a day, maybe a couple of days on a project normally. Often what we'll do is go along to the site and have a look around and understand the building a bit. And one of the things that we like to do is take away some specimens of material. So we'll take a little core sample of material out and do some kind of simple testing on that to help inform the material selection from the database. Yeah, that data goes into the simulation effectively. And so there's a bit of work involved, obviously, in getting the material, and then that lab process of doing the testing. In terms of the simulation, WUFI is pretty user-friendly. It's quite quick to set this stuff up, and then the simulation itself might take maybe 5 minutes for a quick one, or a couple of hours for a really complicated one, even more than that sometimes for a 2D simulation. The value, I guess, is in that interpretation bit and thinking about how all those kind of numbers relate to what's going on in reality. And what we're really doing is providing a professional opinion and a professional risk assessment. One of the things that we struggle with sometimes is with the Glazer calculation. One of the piece of software that does that, it will literally give you a big green tick or a big red cross.
We like big green ticks, but only if they really are a big green tick.
So the trouble is, it's a bit more complicated than that. I think Ben Goldie has got a T-shirt that you can buy with that written on. I don't own one, but with reality, it's always kind of more nuanced than that, particularly with these kind of more complex situations. I mean, and that's difficult because at the end of the day, you've got to make a decision as to whether you build it like that or not, or go and do something else and develop design further. And Yeah, so sometimes when people approach us for this kind of work, they're expecting that big green tick or big red cross response, and there's a bit of an education process to go through to say, well, it might be okay and it might not. And I guess going back to what we were saying earlier about the simple stuff that we know, broadly speaking, that thinner layers of dense capillary active vapor open insulation is okay in most places. We can do that, but I don't feel like we're adding a lot of value to the process, and the suppliers that provide that material are very capable of providing that kind of assessment. And so what we do more of is the more unusual situations, maybe slightly high risk constructions, to provide that sort of extra kind of value where there's that kind of level of uncertainty, and you might be looking at an unusual combination of materials or something that is a bit out of the wheelhouse of the guys that are providing the wood fibre or these other materials.
So because we have the interpretation being a very important part of this, does that mean liability also falls on your shoulders, or is it still the architecture firm to take it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, we're providing a professional service and we're making a recommendation as to whether something's okay or not. I mean, we will frame that in terms of risk, but I don't know, we haven't had one go wrong so far. So I guess, we'll see how that works out. But we approach it in terms of, this is okay, and here are the ways that we can reduce that risk further and make sure that we're not going to have a problem in the future.
And finally, how would you like to end this? Is there an important lesson that we should underline from our conversation today?
Yeah, I would come back to this concept of risk and risk management and risk mitigation, and trying to make sure that someone somewhere along the line is doing an appropriate level of work for that. And that absolutely does not mean that you need to do a WUFI simulation for every build up in every situation for every building in the country. But someone needs to take responsibility for that design to the extent that they've discharged that responsibility and have given an appropriate level of consideration to avoiding moisture risks. So that might be as simple as using a construction that is well established, known to work, or it might be getting someone to do a WUFI simulation, whether that's your insulation supplier, which would be absolutely fine for most situations, or for something that's a bit more left field, someone like me.
Toby, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ben.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/376. We've got a summary there. We've got some screenshots of WUFI in action. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can do that within the show notes. You just need to head down to the bottom, or on social media, we've got links there. We'll link you to GreenGauge, to Toby, houseplanninghelp.com/376. Would you like to continue the learning? Well, if the answer is yes, please, then check out the Hub. This is our membership community that we run alongside House Planning Help, just giving you further things to delve into, whether it's our in-depth video case studies, where we've been out filming through entire construction projects, be it new build or retrofit, or it's our courses where we focus on a particular topic and try and break it down a bit more. Maybe it's our guest experts for live trainings, or Ask the Expert, or Office Hour if you want to chat with me. Or if you want to chat to your fellow members, then you can do that in the members only forum. Come and get some more details, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, we're staying with Toby, but shifting our focus. What did he learn from carrying out his own deep retrofits? We will discuss next time. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.